Mixing with Mike, plugin of the week comes from Audiopunks. It's the Spectra 610 Complimiter. This is a limiter that goes back to the 1960s. What's so special about it is that it is super fast. I don't actually know what the makeup is. Like, is it FET-based? Is it VCA-based? I'm not clear about that. It's hard to find documentation. Maybe somebody here in the chat has information on that. Whatever the case, though, it basically was unique in that it had a limiter built into it with certain settings, limiter only. It had a limiter and compressor, which you could set, or just compression, depending upon the way that you essentially drive it. You have an input control with a fixed threshold. So the fixed threshold is at minus 40 dBu. Now, when you sort of calculate that and how that sort of measures out to dBFS, it ends up being very different, probably something closer to minus 18 in terms of a reference level. But just to give you an idea of kind of where the fixed threshold is set. So you drive the input over the threshold. That's the basic idea. You have an output control for makeup gain. Now, it has an input pad, and maybe perhaps this is because of where the threshold is set. So this is actually padding the gain down on the input level. So as you drive this upward, you're going to have more input gain. So if you want to drive it for more saturation and that kind of thing, then you can put the input pad accordingly. There's a wet-dry control here. You can set the meter to show gain reduction or +4, +12. Let's go over a couple of the other settings here, and then there's only two left. One is the slope. The slope is an interesting one in that it really is the ratio control. So when you set it to 0, it's basically like 100 to 1. And as you crank it up to 10, it just sort of goes downward to basically only limiting. There's sort of a weird thing which I'll explain in a bit, but it essentially just drives downward, so it goes backwards where you would normally expect this to be the lower ratio and this to be the higher ratio. It's the opposite in terms of the way that it works. The release timing. Here I have this written down. The release timing on the compression is 50 milliseconds, and then it goes up to 10 seconds all the way up at the 10 setting. When you get to the limiter, because it has a limiter stage built into it, the release is 90 nanoseconds. That's really freaking fast. So basically what you have is a clipper built into this thing. The attack on it is 100 nanoseconds. and that scales to 2 microseconds. So the attack is on the limiter stage is super fast. Now, the way that you actually control this, if you just want to use the limiter, it all kind of shows up here with the threshold. And then I'll get to this MSM thing here in a second. So the way that you do that is by setting the attack and release up all the way, and then you drive the input so this is just appearing on the clips. So you'll see the threshold being triggered, and essentially what you're getting is like a peak limiter. If you drive more input gain, then what you start to get is compression added in with the limiting, right? So you'll see the threshold kind of on more consistently. And if the threshold is always exceeded, like if this light is just on all the time, then effectively what you have is all compression and no limiting. All of that is just sort of built into the box. How it all relates and triggers and blah, 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 I have no idea. But it sounds really cool, and I want to kind of go over a few things. It's a very aggressive sounding compressor, and we'll kind of go through a bit of those settings. The MSM allows you to change or offset the settings on the left and the right. So what this will do is it basically becomes sort of an imager control. So you get some variance between the left and the right side, and that can kind of open up the sound on things like overheads or room tracks. We'll kind of play around a little bit with that. This is a piece of gear that is essential to Chad Blake's sound. He has a mode called punk mode. We're just going to show that quickly, and it's really straightforward. And I think what you'll find as you're using this is that there are basically two settings that are just kind of quick go-tos, and so let's kind of dive into that a little bit. So what I have here is some drums. I just wanted to show you the peak limiter setting here. I'm going to bring the input gain down here. Let's just see if I can set it up here. So what I'm looking for is just basically my, probably kick and snare triggering the threshold here. So you'll see the light come on there. And in the context of the track, that actually works. I'll show you how that peak limiting kind of helps to open up the imaging of other sounds in the mix. It's like kind of a very common thing to kind of put some kind of a clipper or a peak limiter, but this gives you a bit of a vintage option. Now, there are two variations of it, because there's a modern hardware version, which you can buy, and then there is the vintage original version, and they do have a unique sound from each other. So you'll get a little bit more of a vintage vibe from the vintage setting. Right, so you kind of get a little bit of a grittier kind of sound out of the vintage. So that kind of gives you some options. But I just want to show you what this is like, and just the ability to switch back and forth where there's no gain variation and all that is obviously really important as well. So let's just kind of mix in some bass and guitars here, and then I'll demonstrate this a little bit. So you could hear how that clipping there helps the guitars to sort of stand out a bit from the drums without really compromising the sound of the drums. So, so there's a bit of a thing here to it, and then just the difference between the vintage and the modern inside the track. Let's check that out. Right, so this kind of gives you like a little bit more of a natural sound, and obviously you hear how the vintage sort of degrades the quality of it a bit in a cool way, right? So you can kind of pick one or the other. Now, I can go over here. I just wanted to show you a couple of things. One is the punk mode, which is essentially just making the slope at 0, which makes it 100 to 1. And then the release super fast, so that would be, we're going to have some compression sort of embedded, or a lot of compression kind of embedded in here. So I put the pad back. I'll just set, just so you can hear it, I'll just set the mix control to 100%, and then we can check out the overheads here. Right, so we're obviously going for a very saturated sound. Let's just hear that in the track. Right, so this will make the unpair the left and right sides, so you get more variance between the two, and just notice how that opens up the sound of the overheads. Right, so depending upon whether you want more of a drier centered focus or a little bit more of an open sound, this can also work incredibly well with rooms. I have like a room reverb here that this is on. has some similarities to, 1176 in all buttons mode. This is running just compression. Like, you notice if the threshold is on all the time, that you're getting more of a compression characteristic out of it than with the limiting. And if it's flashing, then you're getting both limiting and the compression kind of kicked in. And if it's just going on the peaks, then you're getting just the limiter kind of built into it, right? So it has some options there just in terms of shaping the sound, all of that feeding into this, and then we can kind of bring similar types of things into some of the other sounds here. So I have just something with the bass. Right, so that's just an aggressive limiting, or heavy compression. I guess it's technically limiting if you're 100 to 1. You can also use it in a way. Just we do it for vocals here. Let's just see. Just to do kind of a quick setting here. Let's see.
Had my first impressions that falling out of place. Instead of shifting gears, you'd rather leave and save face. Live a life of opportunity.
Hold on one second here. I'm going to pull the gain back, put this in just so I'm getting over threshold here a bit.
Had my first impressions that falling out of place. Instead of shifting gears, you'd rather leave and save face. Live a life of opposites, you can't play the same game. I don't understand what's going on, but we can't get back in lane. Had my first impressions that falling out of place. Instead of shifting gears, you'd rather leave and save face. Live a life of opposites, you can't play the same game. I don't understand what's going on, but we can't get back in lane.
Okay, and then we can go between the two different sounds here.
And my first impressions that falling out of place. Instead of shifting gears, you'd rather leave and save face. Live a life of opposites, you can't play the same game.
Right, so what we can basically get here with that kind of solid is more of the pure compression mode. Let's hear the whole thing together now.
And my first impressions that falling out of place. Instead of shifting gears, you'd rather leave and save face. Live a life of opposites, you can't play the same game. I don't understand what's going on, but we can't get back in lane. I wanna make you cry, to answer fire, to life no longer ordinary, taking sides with playing God with both.
So I'm probably driving a bit too much saturation into it, but if you get the basic idea, it's like very aggressive, has a really cool sound. It's nice to have that vintage and modern option just to kind of give you something that's, that's shaped a little bit more tonally with the vintage and a little bit closer to the original with the modern setting. Got a nice edgy kind of cool sound, a really cool option. And also a great alternative to the 1176 all buttons mode, particularly working on things with like where you're heavily compressing or pumping and breathing a room or overheads, and then also just being able to kind of separate the left and right from each other to kind of create some space with it. Gives you a lot of options. A really, really cool one. I really dig this. When I first called it up and did the demo on it, I wasn't so sure, and then as I started to kind of dig into it and understand it a little bit more, I started to become very attached to it, and it's become quickly part of my workflow. All right, so there you have it. From Audiopunks, plugin of the week. It's the Spectra 610 comp limiter. Definitely worth checking out, and that's why it is plugin of the week.